So one thing that I've found in developing automation frameworks for a variety of different projects is that you need to have some set of rules that define how the tests and the framework should be developed. Without having these rules, you end up having tests being created in many different ways that may violate the original principles that you set forth when you created the framework and started creating the tests. So here's my personal set of rules, and I've used these rules on several different projects with great success. And these rules are based around one simple idea, which is that anybody should be able to write a test and understand a test. Not someone who's a programmer, not someone who understands object oriented principles only, but anyone. And the reason why I think this is important is because you end up having a great value if you can have your business people, your domain experts, and your testers write the test and understand the test rather than requiring a developer to do all of the automation. You can still have developers develop the automation framework, but anybody should be able to write a test. So the first rule is to never require tests to declare variables. And this is pretty simple and straightforward. It keeps things really simple and keeps someone from having to know a lot of different programming constructs if they never have to declare a variable. The second one is to never require the test to use a new keyword or create new objects. Again, this makes it so that the person writing the test doesn't have to understand object-oriented concepts and they don't have to know what a constructor is. The third one is to never require the test to manage state on their own. And this can be a little bit tricky because some tests do require some state, but you can almost always find a way to manage state in the framework and prevent the tests from having the complexity of managing their own state. And then the fourth one here is to not expose basically the browser or the document object model to the test. We talked about this a little bit when we said that we never wanted our test to depend on Selenium. We wanted the framework to depend on Selenium and to know about the browser and the actual page, but the tests themselves should be at a much higher level. Now the next rule is that you should always try to reduce the number of parameters for API calls. And this just makes sense because the less parameters that are in a API call, the less complex that call is going to be, the easier it's going to be to understand. We always want to use default values instead of requiring a parameter when possible. And this one we didn't actually see in our examples, but let's suppose that you had some application that required you to create a customer or some kind of object, but you didn't care what it was. Maybe you're in a shipping application and you need to create a new cargo ship, but you don't care what the name of the ship is, you don't care what the capacity is, but you have to have some values for these. Well, if you can default something, go ahead and default it. Build the default into your framework. Maybe make your framework be able to create whatever type of thing that you need to be able to perform a test, but give it random values. If it's a customer, give it a random name and a random address and a random phone number. If you don't care about it, don't require your test to specify it. And this is really key to keeping your tests simple. I've seen tests where we've been able to eliminate 15 to 20, maybe even 100 lines of code in an actual test suite just by using defaults that we build into the framework by creating random customers or random objects instead of having to have the test specify it. Then finally, these last two are more of guidelines here, but we're always going to prefer to make the API easier versus making the internals of the API or the framework itself less complex. So if we have a choice between something that's going to make it easier for someone writing the test or something that's going to make it easier for someone developing the framework, let's make it easier on the person writing the test because you're typically going to have developers working on the framework and they can manage that complexity. They're used to it, but the test should be as simple and straightforward as possible. And then the other guideline here is that you should be using enumerations and constants when requiring the test to pass in primitive types. So you want to try to make the input bounded when possible. And what I mean by this is that if you have some way of making it so that a test can take some options and those options can be bounded, go ahead and do that, because that makes it so that when someone's writing that test, they can hit dot and see what their options are. So anywhere you can restrict the options by making it so that someone can just hit dot and see what they are using IntelliSense, it's going to make it easier for them to write their tests.